Hey folks, welcome to the fourth episode of the Southwestern College Podcast. I'm Professor Luke Cuddy from the philosophy department here on campus, and I'm very excited about this episode because in it we're going to focus on sexual misconduct in general in light of the recent sex scandals in Hollywood, such as with Harvey Weinstein and Louie CK. Our focus, however, will be on Louie CK in particular, because his case raises interesting questions about consent, levels of wrongness, and even forgiveness. And I am here with my girlfriend Lin from the UCSD philosophy department, so I'll now turn to her and let her introduce herself as well as her interest in the topic.
Hi everyone, so I'm really excited to be participating in this discussion primarily for two reasons. The first reason is that as a female, I think I probably have a slightly different perspective on these issues from Luke, both on experiencing sexual misconduct firsthand, but also as a female in general. So I think it's very natural for me to have somewhat of an emotional response towards these issues. But more importantly, I want to see, aside from our very natural emotional responses to these issues, whether we can have a more rational discussion about these. In particular, I want to discuss the element of informed consent, or the lack thereof, in these allegations. I'm studying a course particularly on informed consent in the medical case, and I want to see if theories of informed consent could extend to the sexual misconduct case, and I want to see whether our views on what informed consent is and what factors invalidate informed consent can change or shape our discussion about these issues.
And the reason consent is important there, because if we're talking about a case of rape, say, then consent isn't as important, obviously, because there wasn't, if there's an accusation of rape, then there wasn't any consent by definition. But in the case of, in particular, Louie CK's crimes, the question is, to what extent was consent involved, and to what extent does that lessen what the punishment should be or what the wrongness of the action should be.
Right.
And so that's one of the things we'll target in this podcast. Is one of the things I think we both agree on is that there needs to be some proportion from punishment to crime, rather than kind of tarring everyone with the same brush who's engaged in some sort of sexual deviance, for lack of a better word. So we'll be talking about that. Now, I want to kind of have a disclaimer at the beginning and why this is kind of a personal podcast discussion for me and a personal topic, because I loved Louie CK. He was one of my favorite comedians of all time, if not my top comedian. And it hurts me to see what he did. And I want to say right off the bat that I think what he did was still wrong. So we're going to ask the question of how wrong, that I think that's a legitimate question, but I want to make it clear that, Louie CK exposed himself to some women. And in some cases he had influence over them, being their superior, and working on a show together. These actions are wrong, and I don't think there's any question about that. So it kind of pains me and it hurts me when I see someone who I really admire and respect to do something like that. And it kind of reminds me of when I was younger and I was a big fan of Bill Clinton. I thought he was cool. I thought he was a great president. And then when the Monica Lewinsky scandal came out and some of the other scandals, including a woman who accused him of rape, actually, which we'll talk about later, it made me lose respect for Bill Clinton as well, and I went through a similar situation. Mm-hmm. But again, the question is about the proportion between the accusations and how accurate they are, and the punishment from not just social media and the Twitter mob, so to speak, but also legal criminal punishment that might be meted out.
Right.
So are there any preliminary comments you want to mention about why the topic interests you?
So I think for me there are two separate but related issues here. One is how do we determine, and whether, if we can, in this particular instance, what is the wrongdoing and whether there is a wrongdoing.
Okay.
And the second question would be, depending on how we determine in the first case what kind of punishment this sort of wrongdoing entails, which leads to the question that you just mentioned, the proportionality problem.
Okay.
So I think it would be like a two-step approach to this issue. We could possibly talk about maybe the specifics of the cases, and then to say whether we could gain some insights into like the wrongdoing itself. But I have to make clear that because we're not directly involved in these cases, sometimes it is very hard for us to determine what kind of specifics are actually involved.
Good, yeah.
And these will have big ramifications on
the wrongness,
the wrongdoing.
Yeah.
Whether there is wrongdoing and to what degree.
Good.
So, aside from talking about the specifics, which we should, I think we should also talk more about the conceptual framework of how we determine
the wrongness in the first place. Absolutely. Like for example, questions of perversion. So there's some people who think that might make sort of a natural law type argument. And when I say natural law, I mean the idea that God created the world with a natural world, and heterosexual sex is the normal function, and anything that deviates from that is wrong. So clearly people who have that view, they'll see masturbation as just perverted or wrong.
Right.
And so that it's important that we drill down to that. And it's going to be my view, and I think your view too, that I don't think the act alone of a quote-unquote perverted act that violates nature alone is wrong, because otherwise I'd have to think homosexuality is wrong, and I don't believe that. Right. And I don't think masturbation is wrong. It's about the consent of the other person regarding those acts. Yeah. That's the important consideration. Right. So you can just to not put too fine a point on it, I mean, if you want to get on a clown suit together with your partner and both masturbate in each other's direction, go ahead. If you're both involved, be my guest. I got nothing against that. Right.
I think that's a good point. Understanding what is natural or unnatural may have some other significance, understanding humanity in general, or understanding ourselves in general, having a complete picture of humanity. But I don't think what's natural versus unnatural is directly relevant here, precisely because of the point that you just made. People in general engage in all sorts of weird or
perverted, what could be called
or like
perverted
non-usual things, especially in their private life. So I think this is where the emphasis has to be made on informed consent.
Yeah, and just for anybody arguing, that Louie CK's acts are perverted and wrong just for the sake of the acts themselves, I would encourage you to ask any man in your life or woman about their history and the things they've done and the thoughts they've had, the sorts of, fantasies they've had. I mean, let's be honest, we're sexual beings as human beings. We have, you're born into this world, and that's one of your primary drives is the sex drive. So, I think, again, if we focus on something being perverted and say it's wrong just because it's different or outside the norm, we're going down the wrong road, at least in terms of what we want to talk about in this podcast.
And also another point, maybe this should be the final point before we move on to that. I think I want to say that this whole issue shouldn't be perceived as like this whole men versus women.
Yeah, okay, good.
Like these two camps, out to get each other. Because these issues, framing these issues as, man versus woman, really, on the one hand, trivializes the problem. On the other hand, actually demonizes the problem. Trivializing because it ignores the camps of men who are the victims in many of the cases, as we will later talk about. But at the same time demonizes precisely because it sort of distorts what's important here, which is wrongdoing and victim of wrongdoing and wrongdoer. So I think to really focus solely on men versus women will be sort of missing a very essential aspect of these issues.
Right, and the reason it's important to highlight that is that right now, if you're listening to this, take a look at the media on Louie CK in particular, and you'll see that many of the articles are framed precisely in terms of men versus women, women being denied opportunities and so forth. And again, it's not that we're denying that does happen to women, perhaps disproportionately.
Absolutely, yeah.
But as Lin points out, it's deeper than that. And let me just give one example before we move on. There was a recent case of Bayou Phillips, who's a kind of a lesser-known actress, but still has a little bit of fame, who supposedly sexually harassed a gay man on a set in, I think, 2002 or 2003. And you can check in the HuffPost, there was a recent apology she made about this. And basically she was, I think she was threatening to... she was making fun of him for being gay, first of all, threatening him and threatening to come out. And I think at the time he hadn't come out to his family. And she was threatening to expose him. And, so that just illustrates that it doesn't seem to be a man-to-woman issue, even if it often goes that way. I'm sorry, it doesn't seem to be an only man and woman issue.
Right. So I think it's important to distinguish the historical significance, meaning that women, historically speaking, are... have been subject to inequality for a long time. And that's historically significant and culturally and politically significant today. But I think it's important to distinguish that versus what are at stake in these cases of wrongdoing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So perhaps it would be good to move on to... if you want to talk about the... so let me jump in. What I want to do next is I want to read, just kind of emphasize some of the main points from the original New York Times article on Louie. That it's called, again, you can look this up in the New York Times. It's called "Louie CK is accused by 5 women of sexual misconduct." And I just want to go down those experiences so we kind of have a background. More concrete,
And then those of you who aren't familiar, those of you who are, will know that Louie issued an apology and a statement taking responsibility and claiming that the stories were true. So it's not a question of if these are true, but what is a question is the details, as Lin pointed out earlier. And we'll mention those as I'm going through this article. So I want to first go through this article and then briefly read Louie's statement, and then we'll go from there.
Right.
Okay, so the first incident happened in 2002, so quite a long time ago. And these 2 women who got their big break, they were comedians, to perform at a comedy arts festival in Aspen. They met Louie there, who was at the festival, and Louie invited them to hang out in their hotel room for a nightcap. Right? Presumably they'd been drinking, or they were going to drink, one or the other. The bars were closed and they wanted to celebrate. They admired him and so forth. And they did say that they believed his intentions seemed collegial at the time.
Okay.
Right? So that was their perception.
Okay.
However, when they sat in his room, they were all bundled up because it was cold. And I guess they talked for a bit and Louie said, "Can I take out my penis?" Right? So that's when. And the women thought it was a joke and laughed it off, but they didn't say no. And then he did it. And then he got naked on the bed and masturbated in front of them. Okay, so that's one incident.
So, just one clarification. They didn't say no, but they
didn't say yes.
either.
Right, so raising this issue of consent, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
at least according to this article.
Okay.
And in 2003, so the next year, another woman invited Louie. I guess they must have had a correspondence before and met before. And she called Louie to invite him to one of her shows, and during the phone conversation, she could hear him masturbating as they spoke. Right, so this is the one that people are saying is the least important, because it was on the phone, she could hang up. But anyways, we can talk about that later. I mean, it's still problematic, obviously.
Right.
But that's all that's said in this article. That one line is that she called and she could hear him masturbating. That's it.
So, sorry, what was the relation between them two?
All it says is that this woman was another comedian who invited him to her show. So we're presuming they had contact before. Okay. Yeah, colleagues of some kind.
Right.
Yeah, so they weren't. Well, they were colleagues of comedy, not colleagues of like the same show.
Right.
Okay. And then another comedian in 2005 now, so a couple years later, said she was appearing with Louie on a television pilot. So Louie was on a show with her. She was working on the show. And he asked her, apparently, if he could masturbate in front of her, and she said no. And that was another case. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess there's more details that this article gives to those... to this woman on the show that they were working on the pilot together. So in this same instance, in 2005, apparently she was working as a performer and producer on the television pilot, which was a big step in her career. And Louie was a guest star, obviously more famous than her. And he approached her as they were walking on the set, and she claims that he leaned in close to my face and said, "Can I ask you something?" And she said yes. And he said, and then she says, he asked if we could go to my dressing room so he could masturbate in front of me. She was angry, said no, and pointed out that he had a daughter and pregnant wife. And then Louie apparently, and then she says, his face got red and he told me he had issues. But I guess nothing else ever came about it.
I see.
Okay, so that's another case.
So I think this case, perhaps, it also has the further complications of, the details of how his wife were pregnant.
Yes.
And he had a daughter. So maybe perhaps we could throw these details out, but make clear that, we want to talk specifically about the rawness involved in the particular case of asking this woman on set.
Well, he's married, you mean?
No, throwing out the details of...
Oh, I see. You're saying just focusing on... Yeah,
just focusing on the particular case of him asking her whether he could masturbate on her.
Okay. We can do that. And then the fifth woman, who did not identify herself to protect her family. The other women's names are in the article if you want to look them up. But when Louie CK was the head writer on the Chris Rock show, basically this woman claims that repeatedly he asked her to watch him masturbate, and she claims she was in her early 20s and she went along with his request both times. I guess there was multiple times in this case, but later regretted it. So this is one of those interesting cases about consent, isn't it? Because she did go along with it multiple times, but at the same time, he held influence and power over her.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
Now, I guess I'd be remiss not to mention this detail. In the case of the women in the hotel room, the way they claim that it ended is after he masturbated to completion, ejaculated on his stomach, and then after that, they ran out of the room. Okay, so that's...
Yeah, right.
So they waited until he was done and then left, I guess.
That could be a detail that indicates that they were extremely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They...
But, I mean, but what other people have said is, well, why didn't they run out right away? Or, I don't know. We'll get there later. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out, Tignataro, which is actually another female comedian who Louie CK helped out, and I actually remember when he promoted her comedy special and she rose to power and fame. And I actually enjoy her comedy. I think she's funny, personally. She spoke out against Louie, and she said she felt trapped by him because she felt, obviously some sort of obligation to him for giving her this opportunity. But at the same time, she had heard rumors about the way he was treating other women. Now, one thing she says, though, that I disagree with is she says she fears that Louie released his album, which he did on his website, to cover his tracks. He knew it was going to make him look like a good guy supporting a woman. I think that's a little bit overly speculative. It's not clear that that's the reason why Louie did this. It's not. I mean, he could have just genuinely thought she was funny and just been a disturbed guy. It's not clear that this was all premeditated and that he wanted to do this and make himself look better and cover up his deeds from before. I mean, it's not, maybe, I'm not saying it's not true, but this New York Times article is a little bit biased in that direction and seems to assume that it is true.
Right. So I think for the purpose of our discussion, it might be good to just throw that out.
Okay, yeah, because we're talking about consent. Okay.
We're talking about specifics.
Okay, so let me move to just one last, because I want to move past this article. So one last thing about this article that's important, I think, regarding the punishment is the remorse that one feels, right? Like if somebody does something wrong and they just say screw you and spit in your face and don't admit it, that's different than someone who says, look, I'm really sorry, this is a problem.
Right.
And so not only has Louie said sorry recently, but he also apologized to some of these women later, albeit in sort of a strange way sometimes. So for instance, in 2009, 6 years after the woman who got the phone call from Louie and he was masturbating, he sent her a Facebook message saying, last time I talked to you ended in a sordid fashion. That was a bad time in my life and I'm sorry, he says. And she forgave him for it, she said. And she accepted the apology, but she nevertheless said it left her dispirited, and she said it was one of the things that actually discouraged her from going further into comedy. So that's pretty big thing too.
So I think it's important to distinguish between what role remorse plays in forgiveness versus what role remorse plays in
punishment,
in determining wrongdoing.
Okay.
Because I think remorse. You're right to say that a wrongdoer who has expressed remorse seems to us to, he or she looks better than a wrongdoer who thinks there is no regrets or remorse to be expressed at all.
Right.
That is correct, and I think that demonstrates our intuitions. But I think remorse on its own does not and should not affect our attribution of wrongdoing. I think when we attribute wrongdoing and determine the degree of wrongdoing, I think we should solely look at the time of wrongdoing.
Yeah,
you're
that's
right
fine.
that remorse could have some implications in attribution of punishment or
yeah, but that was my only point.
Okay.
I wasn't bringing up remorse to suggest that it should make his wrong any less.
Right.
I was bringing it up regarding
I just want to make that
regarding
clear.
the way that that society responds to him later.
Okay.
So that was my only point there. So there's a few other points in the article you can take a look at. As Lin points out, we should probably just focus on a few things. We can't go into everything here.
Right.
But what I want to do before we actually step into the next stage of the podcast here is just read Louie's statement. And I think it's important to point out and to criticize Louie here because when these ideas were brought to his attention prior, he dismissed them as rumors and he didn't address them, like even 6 months ago. So he seems to have wanted to put it in his past and try and just hope that it wasn't going to come to get him. So that's his fault, right? He didn't take responsibility then. And so, but to be fair, he still did take responsibility now, and most people who've been accused have not even done that. So here's what his apology letter says. He says, "These stories are true. At the time, I said to myself that what I did was okay because I never showed a woman my dick without asking first, which is also true." So I just want to point out there, he's claiming that he always asked in some manner or another, right? Which relates to consent. And then he goes on to say, "But what I learned later in life, too late, is that when you have power over another person, asking them to look at your dick isn't a question. It's a predicament for them. The power I had over these women is that they admired me, and I wielded that power irresponsibly. I have been remorseful of my actions, and I've tried to learn from them and run from them. Now I'm aware of the extent of the impact of my actions. I learned yesterday the extent to which I left these women who admired me feeling badly about themselves and cautious around other men who would never have put them in that position. I also took advantage of the fact that I was widely admired in my and their community, which disabled them from sharing their story and brought hardship to them when they tried because people who look up to me didn't want to hear it. I didn't think that I was doing any of that because my position allowed me not to think about it. There is nothing about this that I forgive myself for, and I have to reconcile it with who I am, which is nothing compared to the task I left them with. I wish I had reacted to their admiration of me by being a good example to them as a man and given them some guidance as a comedian, including because I admired their work." He goes on to say, "The hardest regret to live with is what you've done to hurt someone else, and I can hardly wrap my head around the scope of hurt I brought them." I won't actually read all the rest because he goes on to just say he's sorry about the pain he's brought on the other people involved in his other shows and so forth. And then he ends the apology letter by saying, "I have spent my long and lucky career talking and saying anything I want. I will now step back and take a long time to listen. Thank you for reading." So that's his apology letter after all that. So I think the first thing to point out is he takes responsibility for all of the claims.
Right, but also noted that he at least tried to avoid taking responsibility.
He did, and he admits that. He says, "I ran from it."
Right.
He's basically coming full circle and saying, "Look, I fucked up in many, many ways. Not only did I do something wrong, but I covered it up and I ran from it and I harmed other people in my life."
Right.
Yeah, so again, I agree. He doesn't deserve full credit there because he could have come clean before.
Yeah.
But at least he came clean in some way.
So I think for my interest, I think we should really focus on what is the seriousness of his wrongdoing itself.
Okay. So why don't by getting at that question, I think the next thing I want to do is that there are some top comments on the New York Times article from readers and others that have been rated the top comments, and I kind of chose some of them to read so that they can be talking points for us, and then I'll address some of these points. And so I think this first comment kind of touches on that. So I'll read this comment, and then tell me what you think and how it relates to what you just said.
Sure.
Okay, so the top comment is referring to what is a comment on the original New York Times article with the 5 women that I read at first. And this commenter says, "Gross, yes. Criminal, no. Having a fetish isn't illegal. If he used his position and power to coerce women to watch him, surely that is wrong. But it sounds like he gave women the opportunity to say no." What do you think?
So I think on its own, this comment is insightful in the sense that it brings out exactly the point, the significance of the opportunity to do otherwise, or as we say, respect for autonomy or informed consent. But I think it's important to look at the specifics and think whether it is consistent to say that these women are subject to undue influence, meaning the position or power Louie had over them, whether it's consistent to say that they were subject to these kinds of undue influence, and also that they had the opportunity to do otherwise, to walk out or to say no. Because I think undue influence, particularly undue influence from a powerful figure, could significantly invalidate any sort of consent.
So to take it to the example of the women who sat or watched him masturbate on the bed, right? So they're up there in the room, and apparently they're not expecting anything like this, and then he takes it out and he starts masturbating,
right?
And they start laughing awkwardly, and then they're paralyzed by the situation, so much so that you could argue they didn't have any free will right there. So when somebody says, "Well, you could have just left," maybe that's an unfair argument, because maybe they couldn't, because they were paralyzed by this. First of all, they're in a position of admiration, and Louie's in a position of power over them.
Right.
And secondly, the act itself was just so strange and out of the blue that they couldn't handle it.
Right. So, 2 points. One is that someone could also hold the view that sex and sexual context is special in the sense that it has a lot of implications on our psychology, our metaphysics, our body in general. So because of the special status of sex and sexual context, some could say that only explicit verbal consent counts. Yeah, is sufficient.
Okay.
So body language or gestures or implicit consent, like not saying no, that those instances of consent don't count. So someone could hold this view, but even for someone who does not think we need explicit verbal consent, that person could still say that in the hotel case, woman who didn't say no and then they stayed over the whole time, even if someone thinks that's consent, that is still invalidated to a great degree, perhaps because Louie sort of put these women into a position where they had to think about the consequences of their rejection or their
right. But so you don't think, because somebody could make the argument that they might distinguish between a case where a guy walks up to a woman on the subway in the corner and no one else is on the subway and he exposes himself to her or something like that, versus what Louie did, where these women went all the way up to his apartment together to drink. Now, some might argue that it's worse in the case of the person on the subway, and it's better in the case of Louie because there's sort of an expectation in that situation that there might be something more, and it could have been that he just misread the situation. I mean, did they? So I guess what I'm asking is, one could make the argument that did they bear some responsibility for having agreed to go up to the hotel room and drink, or no?
So I think they're responsible for choosing to go up to the hotel room, but I don't think that entails any even partial responsibility of the later things, because I think there's this idea of opacity of consent, meaning that in normal cases we would say if A entails B and B entails C, then A entails C, right? So this transitivity. But in the context of consent, me consenting to one thing that necessarily leads to, or not necessarily, but me consenting to one thing which leads to another thing does not at all imply me consenting to that other thing.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's no transitivity there,
right?
Because once you're in that, maybe there's an ontological difference, we could say.
Right. Consent is such a thing that you yourself have to be fully aware of the connection between the first thing and the latter thing.
Okay.
In order for you to be
but let's back up. Maybe someone could say maybe they're partially aware, because I mean it's common knowledge that an entertainer, someone in the entertainment industry, you go up to their hotel room, right? I mean, isn't there some awareness that could lead to some sort of sexual behavior?
I think it's important to
drink too. To drink,
right? But I actually don't agree. I think it's important to distinguish between what's going on in a lot of cases versus what should be the case. It's true that in the entertainment industry, one could say that just this kind of using each other to climb up the ladder, or in any social circumstances, like using alcohol to sort of ease
but if we're talking about their awareness of the situation, doesn't it matter how things actually are? Like, doesn't that relate to their consent? Even if things should be different, but if that's the way things are, doesn't that relate to their consent if they're aware of the way things are, or no?
So I think that it's right to say that they could have some awareness of by going up to the hotel room, what could possibly be down the road. But still, as I said, I think sex or sexual context is different from other contexts in which, because of the significance and consequences of sexual activities, I think it's important to have a more robust account of consent.
Well, okay, so I get that, but I guess let's think of another situation where instead of going back to his hotel room to drink, they're all hanging out after the show and they just go to a restaurant to get some food. Right? Isn't there there are different expectations about that scenario? Like in the case of consenting to go up to a bedroom to drink, there's at least the suggestion that there could be a more intimate, not necessarily sexual, but a more intimate, more deeply connected experience to be had there than if you're going out to a restaurant in public somewhere else.
Right, I could see that, but still, I think one could say, by going up to the hotel room, being fully aware of, the setting to be a very intimate setting, surely, I think Louie would not be wrong to sort of flirt with a woman, or engaging.
So you think he went too far with that intimacy,
right? Because I think the very sexual act of masturbation is so different from just merely engaging intimate conversations or flirting with each other.
Well, that's why I think that there are some people, if you look around the internet, saying that Louie's actions are premeditated and he meant to do this. I based on what I'm hearing, I don't think that's true. I think he misread. It sounds to me like he misread the situation. He didn't quite. And again, I'm not expressing that like I'm proving that, but I'm saying the evidence points more in that direction to me, that he misread what was going on, that he thought that there was more of an intimate connection with these women than there actually was. Because again, let's envision another scenario. Forget about Louie for a minute. You just have a famous entertainer, and two women go up to his room, and he asks them, "Can I, pull out my dick or something?" And they don't really say yes or no, and he does it, and then they all have a threesome together, and they don't regret it, and afterwards they say, "Yeah, we wanted to have sex with them." Right? I mean, that's a different kind of scenario.
So, two things. One thing is that I think you're right to say that the specific context of hotel room, could suggest that Louie was just misreading signals. Yeah. But I think it's important to distinguish between misreading the signals and thinking that these women were actually interested in you romantically or sexually versus the actual action of masturbation. Because again, the significance of sex, the act of masturbation, I really do think requires explicit informed consent, while thinking that other people were interested in you does not.
Okay, so do you think this would be a good time to talk about different levels of consent? So maybe I can present this point that we talked about before off the podcast, and you can kind of look at it and tell me your views on consent, and because you have more knowledge than me about consent.
Sure.
So we talked about how one could actually say that almost nobody consents to what they do ever, because the social forces are so powerful that people think they're doing what they want to do and they think they're consenting to things, but the way society is set up is such that it pushes them to do certain things, and even if they say they want to, they haven't actually chosen. So for instance, feminists have made this argument, some feminists have made this argument about the concept of marriage, that it's sort of, society is so deterministic that a woman might say, I want to get married to a man and I want to be the housewife and so forth, but they're not actually consenting to that because they're the victims of an extremely complex power structure that makes them think they want to be a housewife, but they really don't. So they say they've consented, but they really haven't consented. So one could argue that even if those women had explicitly said yes to Louie, please masturbate in front of me, and he did it, and on that argument about consent, it could still be seen as wrong, because even if they said yes, one could argue, but the situation was such that it was going to push them to say that even though they didn't really want it. Mm-hmm. So that's one extreme view of consent. What other ways could we discuss consent?
So just to comment on the argument that you just mentioned, I think it's an extremely interesting position, and I think it's right to point out that particularly women and minorities, even due to the historically inferior positions that these two groups or other groups, LGBT community, for example, because of the fact that these communities have been under certain inferior positions in our society, they are more likely to suffer this overarching undue influence that you just mentioned. Okay. Like thinking that I'm making autonomous choices, but really I'm being I'm subjected to the whole social setting. But at the same time, I think it's probably wise to backtrack a little bit to ask, what are we really talking about when we talk about informed consent? Okay. Because it's not very agreed upon as to what is the justification for informed consent. Meaning, why do we value informed consent? So one principle is that we should respect people's autonomy. So here, autonomy could be understood both in the Kantian sense of, like a person is an end in itself, in herself or in himself, that deserves dignity.
Yeah.
So that's the Kantian sense of autonomy.
Okay.
And also there's this Millian or consequentialist account of autonomy, which is that people should decide their own life, make choices for themselves autonomously.
Okay.
So that's one principle to justify informed consent. So in the sexual context, we could say that we want informed consent precisely because we think respecting people's autonomy or respecting people's choices to engage or not to engage in sexual activities, that's really important.
Okay.
But there's also some other kind of justification for informed consent, which is maybe one could say less robust, which is informed consent just is consent that's free of coercion or undue influence.
Okay.
So under this view, it would be valid consent as long as I don't coerce the person into consenting, or I don't have undue influence over this person.
Okay, go ahead.
So coercion is different from undue influence in the sense that coercion is making threats to the person, saying that, hey, if you don't have sex with me, I am going to
can those threats be nonverbal, or do they have to be verbal?
So traditionally it's understood as verbal threats, but it could also be less explicit, more implicit in the sense that if I mention to you, if you don't have sex with me, really, like, I'm gonna blah blah blah,
right.
Or like, if you don't have sex with me, I'm gonna kill myself. If you don't have sex with me, then I'm not gonna realize the obligation or promises that I made to you before.
Gotcha.
So that would be coercion. But undue influence on the other hand, which I think is more relevant at least in the Louie CK case, undue influence is when you either significantly impact people's judgments of what is actually at stake by engaging in this activity, so that meaning really, like, your influence over me could actually blind me in fully realizing the scope and significance of participating in this activity.
So that would apply to most of the cases of Louie.
Right.
Is that not true?
To some degree, yeah. But also there's also this other kind of undue influence is even when I am fully informing this person of the scope and significance of this situation, but due to my power or due to my influence over this person actually lacks this full rationality to make better judgments for herself or himself. So a case that's really interesting, I don't know if you have heard of this case, but I forgot. But anyway, the gist of the case is that this super rich man, millionaire, says to a woman, hey, so if you want to be my mistress and have sex with me, then I could pay for all the medical bills of your child. So this woman has a child who is super, super sick and would lose his life without these medical treatments. So this millionaire is saying that if you be my mistress and have sex with me, then I will be able to save your child. So in this case, this woman, by stipulation, like, she's fully aware of the scope and significance of the situation, which is that I gotta be this man's mistress and, you know, have sex with this man. So, like, she is fully aware of the scope and ramification. But at the same time, the influence of losing a child versus her child being saved, that's such a great influence on her that it could actually impel her to make a judgment that's not a result of her full rationality.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even though she's fully conscious and fully aware of what's going on,
right?
So I guess taking it back to the Louie case, that, I mean, you could definitely say that was true in the case of the woman in the hotel room,
right?
And you could certainly say it was true in the case of the woman on the TV show, even though she supposedly consented twice to watch him masturbate. I mean, that just the mere fact of the situation of him having that power takes away her autonomy, I guess, in some sense, or takes away her rational capacity to make a decision.
Right. But I think it's important to also ask how much influence, how much undue influence did he really have over these women, because that matters. Yeah. Both for the sake of determining whether these women did give informed consent or not, but also relevant for determining the proportionality of Louie CK's punishment.
Okay. So maybe we can transition on to the punishment then. I did want to read one other comment, just to it kind of touches on what we said before, because somebody could make the argument that, and many people do and have made this argument, that I guess it's the argument that just leave the room, just leave the room, it's not a big deal. And then some other people will say, well, the act of just masturbating in front of someone, that's not that bad. It's not like he assaulted you or he grabbed you or he was violent towards you or raped you or anything. He just masturbated in front of you. What's the big deal? Like, just accept it and move on. And so here's one of the commenters on the New York Times article says this in response to that argument. And she says, having someone masturbate in front of you, while repulsive and dehumanizing, is not the worst trauma these women went through. The ongoing severe damage is their loss of career opportunities because powerful men had no problem with protecting their own careers and reputations at the expense of women. To recap, sexual harassment is bad because it harms women socially, economically, and creatively, not because we can't cope with a moment of feeling threatened and grossed out. Right? So that points out that... So, well, go ahead. What do you think about...
No, I think it's not... At least this comment on its own, it's not very fair to say that it's not the case that sexual harassment has such a huge influence due to the ramifications it has on women's psychology and body, but rather career opportunities. I think it's not a very fair way to put it.
So you're saying that the act itself is worse than this person is making it seem, like the act of masturbating in front of you?
No, I think masturbating in front of... I think this person is not taking the act itself seriously enough.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. You're saying the act is more serious than...
Right.
So I guess the main point she's making there is that because, from a utilitarian standpoint, if we just care about how much harm does something directly do to you, the consequences, like a lot of people would look at that behavior and say, well, it's just masturbation. It's not that big a deal. No one's doing anything to your body, or it's not, it shouldn't be on the same place as rape or any sort of violent behavior towards someone.
Of course, I think you have to... Of course, it's not the same as rape or violent crimes, so that's a clear distinction. But to say that because it's just mere masturbation, it's not a big deal is exactly contradicting the significance of what we value in sexual context, which is informed consent. And I think that to put a more utilitarian some spin on this and say that women seem to, be more troubled by their lost career opportunities.
Let's put it this way. Let's say that it's the same exact scenario. Women have lost their career opportunity. Same scenario. They go up to the hotel room, but Louie had actually had actually shoved them against the wall and like raped one of them and like punched the other one or something. And let's say in both cases they lost the same career opportunities, but wouldn't we still make a distinction and say that other one's worse than the one where he just masturbates? Yeah, of course.
As I said, there's a clear distinction between masturbating in front of someone and raping someone. Of course, no one is denying that.
Well, some people are, though, because not you. I'm not saying you are, but that's one of my other points that I want to talk about here is that the media in particular is treating it this way. There's some articles in the Atlantic, the Washington Post, New York Times that directly compare Louie CK to Harvey Weinstein.
I think the parallel between Louie's masturbating in front of women versus raping someone, I think the parallel could be about the lack of informed consent, so to speak, in both cases.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying
the seriousness differs,
yeah.
But I think what is at stake and what captures a lot of people's intuition about the terribleness of these two cases is exactly that there seems to be a lack of informed consent in both cases.
Yeah. So that's fair, but again, the degree to which there's the lack of informed consent seems to be quite different. There's less informed consent in the case of rape or assault than there is in the case of Louie's situation.
Right.
And so that's exactly the point, is that we have to be able to make those distinctions. And this is one of the arguments I would make about this whole situation is, who are we as humans, as a society, if we can't have a proportion from punishment to crime, if we can't look at something and say, that's a little bit bad, that's worse, that's still really bad, but it's, not as bad as this. But nobody's doing that. Everybody's painting it with a simple black and white, right and wrong, sort of biblical sense of there's only good and evil type of thing, instead of seeing gradations in people's actions.
I do think that there is, at least from my personal view, there is a clear distinction, at least in the legal case, of right and wrong. But within the wrong group, there is we should distinguish between among different degrees of wrongdoing.
Yeah.
So it's not so much as, this is right, and this is not so right, and this is not so wrong. Instead, I think that in the legal case, there is a clear distinction between right and wrong, but within the wrongness camp, there is
variation.
Right.
Yeah. So let me read another comment, and I've read some comments that I didn't agree with. Now I'm going to read one that I agree with that coincides with what just was said. So another reader at the end of this New York Times article says, reading all these comments and the news lately, everyone seems to be treating these actions as black or white. There are gray lines here and degrees of impropriety here, folks. Doing something like this after asking for permission and later apologizing is very different than rape, which is what Weinstein is accused of. As a feminist, I'm very concerned that this whole thing will backfire and victims of violent crimes won't be taken as seriously because of the barrage of fear over nonviolent crimes. And I just want to stop for a minute and highlight that point. That's exactly, I couldn't agree more with that particular point. It will backfire on us if we start indiscriminately calling people out. It's the same concept of just indiscriminately calling everybody a racist just because somebody, maybe said something a little bit insensitive. That's not the same as somebody like Richard Spencer, who's a Nazi, and painting everybody with the same brush, like you're all racist bigots, or you're all just sexual deviant pieces of shit, and I don't care if you assaulted someone or if you just masturbated in front of someone. I don't care what the charges are. If you did anything like that, you're just wrong, and end of story. And the problem with that is that exactly what this person says, now we're not going to take serious crimes as seriously because we'll see them all in the same level. But if we can, as a society, make distinctions so that people are called out for the things they've done wrong and made to pay and made to be shamed, but not overly shamed or not shamed as much as somebody else who has done something significantly more wrong than that other thing.
Right.
Let me just read the rest of this comment. This person says, further, Louie CK himself has been relatively open about his awkwardness and personal issues. He asked these ladies for permission and appears to have misread the situation. He thought about it for years and even contacted the women on his own to apologize later. Over the past decade, he has spoken out strongly in favor of women's rights and against misogyny. Why do we want to attack someone on the same side who has shown remorse and even apologized for his prior actions and appears to have bettered himself since? And this is the point that I would emphasize again. Another point I would emphasize is there is something very wrong in our society when there seems to be an ever-growing hunger for vengeance, humiliation, and locking people up, rather than trying to figure out the underlying issues, fix and heal our society, and modify men's behavior in general. So I want to highlight that last point that with all these articles that are equating Louie to Weinstein and other people who have been accused of rape, we see this, it's like what people want is for the perpetrator to suffer. It's like they care more about that person being strung out to dry than they care about actually rectifying the situation to make women's rights more equal, or to improve the case for women's rights. They're more concerned that these men in power get knocked down and are shamed, and everybody sees their shame, and they just keep rubbing it in their face, than they're concerned with actually advancing women's rights. Now, I know that's to some extent a false dilemma, because of course you can shame somebody and of course you can also care about women's rights, but the point is that when you overly focus on these things, you have power and you're a writer in the media, you're actually influencing people to believe that simplistic idea that there's only one way to think about sexual deviance, that whether you did a less wrong action like exposing yourself or you full on rape someone, it's the same thing. That just doesn't seem fair.
So, just a couple of responses towards this particular comment. Okay. One is that this comment is assuming that there is permission involved.
That's true. That the
right,
comment,
this comment,
yeah.
It just keeps mentioning about what is so wrong of what he did if he asked for permission.
He says, I want to just clarify, he does say that Louie asked for permission. He doesn't necessarily say that the woman granted it. Right. I don't think, yeah. Right,
so, but also a point that when you say you asked for permission, it could be the case that when you ask for permission, you really are saying that I will do this. Precisely because of power that you could have over these women.
So I guess it goes back to consent.
Right, asking for permission is the opposite side of informed consent, in the sense that asking for permission is from the in this case Louie's perspective, and giving consent is from women's perspective, and having these having super powerful influence over one party over the other, it could even invalidate.
So even the asking for permission could be invalidated by the situation, like you talked about before.
Right. What you were really saying when you ask for permission is to tell these women that I will do this. Right.
So that's fair. Now, but what about the other part of the comment that go ahead.
So about the comment about focusing on pushing these men down would kind of take the attention away from really establishing equality for women.
Yeah.
But I think that at least the very fact that women in this society feel more comfortable about standing up and telling stories about their experiences and their uncomfort in the past, I think that's an indication of progress made within women's rights.
Yeah, but I think they can make that same progress, and they can still at least, like I said, I believe Louie should have been partially shamed, at least somewhat shamed. But they could do that without publishing article after article that just re-shames him again and again. And I think there was another article yesterday that talked about how both Louie and Harvey Weinstein were hypocrites because they promoted women's rights while also in their personal lives, harming women. Right. And so I think you can advance women's rights without shaming someone so much that you're holding their head in the mud and you're just saying, say sorry, motherfucker. I mean, it's like, it's hardcore shaming.
Right.
And again, when that becomes the focus, and then that leads other people to get this sense of vengeance, like, yeah, see, I knew it. I did, like, these assholes are getting what they deserved, right? And then it takes focus. It's bringing out the wrong part in human nature, is what I'm saying. Right. By focusing mainly on the shaming, which again is mostly what's been done in most of these articles, in many of the big name publications. By focusing mostly on the shaming, you're taking away.
So I agree with you that it just seems like the trend in our society when something comes out is to immediately focus on the information given without even investigating or critically thinking about the two sides, both sides to the issue.
And the details and context.
Right, exactly. I agree. Specifics matter, especially in these kinds of cases involved with consent. So I definitely agree with you that we have this trend of oh, geez, there's this issue on Twitter, or there's this issue on Facebook. Let me get on it, or like let me express my liberal views or conservative views.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's exactly what the term virtue signaling refers to. You know that term, right?
Could you explain?
I actually think let me be clear here that this isn't the full academic definition, and I actually think there's some scholars who are against the term, but basically what it means is that it's when you want to show everybody else how great you are. So for instance, you post, look, I was in Ecuador and I worked on this thing and we saved this many lives, and we revamped this community, and it's like the main reason you're doing that is to show how good you are, rather than focus on the actual bettering of the culture or the society or whatever.
Yeah, so when a lot of people immediately get on the process of commenting on an issue without critically evaluating the specifics is a sort of virtue signaling, in the sense that they want to indicate that they care about the issue, which is great. But
But the problem with virtue signaling is that the thing they most care about, according to this theory, is the signal. In other words, it's selfish, because they want to show everybody else how good they are.
Right, to demonstrate that they have some very unique views on, or like maybe not unique, but the quote unquote right views on these issues.
Yeah, and it just takes me back to, he who is free from sin cast the first stone, the biblical story, and then nobody casts the stone because nobody's free from sin. So many people are casting all these stones in society and showing how everyone else is wrong and taking everyone else down. And all the while, of course, they're sinners in their own way, and they have their own sexual deviances, as I pointed out before. But the main issue is that by tarring people this way and by making it a black and white issue, it ignores the fact that humans are complicated beings, and it also fails to acknowledge another biblical and also concept in many other religions, that of compassion and forgiveness. And again, maybe this can take us into, this can be our final topic, the punishment, as to what the punishment should be, and what sort of punishments are justified for particular actions. But before we get there, I don't think we've actually yet discussed the differences in the terms like sexual misconduct and assault and rape and so forth.
So I have to admit that I'm not extremely super clear on the distinctions, but I believe sexual misconduct is actually an umbrella term that could encompass sexual harassment, sexual assault, things like that.
Now, from what I read too, and I also admit I'm not fully clear on this, but from what I looked at, sexual assault in most states, first of all, it involves consent, so there has to be some lack of consent, and we already just talked about the issues there. But sexual assault actually could include just exposing yourself if there wasn't the lack of consent. That's the lowest form of sexual assault. It's the least harmful. But most sexual assaults are violent. Most sexual assaults are direct, violent, and obviously rape is the ultimate version of it. And I just want to express that I actually don't like that the fact that you expose yourself is included under sexual assault. Because assault outside of the sexual context typically means like a physical, direct action that you're interfering with somebody else. So I think to call and exposing yourself sexual assault is a bit of a stretch.
So both sexual assault and sexual harassment are terms that specifically emphasize the point of coercion.
Okay.
So forcefully coerce someone into engaging in activities that are sexual in nature.
Well, so that means depending on the level of coercion, Louie's actions either were sexual assault or they could have been nothing.
Actually, the point I want to make is that I think there isn't any coercion involved in.
I'm sorry, I meant undue influence.
Right. So if we can be sure that it's undue influence that was doing the work in Louie CK's case, then we can't really attribute terms like sexual harassment and sexual assault to him precisely because these two things are dependent on coercion.
Okay, so if undue influence is lesser than coercion because of that, then it can't be considered assault.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's at least what I think.
Okay, I mean that's fair, and I just want to relate the story that I related to you earlier that I had actually forgotten about regarding sexual assault, and this is another reason why I don't like the fact that sexual assault can actually be considered this way, the way it's defined. So one time I was working on a dig in the Middle East, and there was a gay guy on the site. And he was a cool guy. We were friends and stuff. But there was one time when we were standing around a dig site, and he and I were standing in the back around this big group, and he grabbed my ass. He grabbed my ass, like, hard.
Right.
And then I kind of looked at it. I was like, what the hell? And he just kind of laughed at me, and he said, I did it because I know you can take it.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, it didn't actually bother me that much. It really didn't bother me that much. I thought it was a little weird, but I never lost any sleep over it. It never mattered to me. And yet, technically, that would be assault because he did not get my permission.
Right.
And so that's what I mean by these umbrella terms about these sexually deviant behaviors or criminal behaviors, potentially criminal. I don't think we have it right. I mean, a lot of these terms encompass too many things that have different degrees of harm that don't seem to coincide to the wrongdoing, in my opinion. Like the wrongdoing of this guy grabbing my ass, in my opinion, was actually not even as bad as Louie masturbating in front of the women. And yet there's a case to be made that what he did was assault to me and that Louie did not engage in assault. Right? But relative to what Louie did also, I also think that is way lesser a crime than obviously rape or actually physically assaulting someone during sex. Forcing them to have sex with you or actually hurting them and holding them down and giving them bruises or something.
Right. So that's why I think it's actually possibly right to use the term sexual misconduct because sexual misconduct has more of a moral this notion of moral blameworthiness in it. In terms like sexual harassment and sexual assault, these are legal terms. The sexual misconduct, at least not in all jurisprudence, is a legal term. It carries with it more moral significance in this term. So like our moral condemnation of the wrongdoer.
Right.
And also sexual misconduct could actually encompass undue influence. But sexual harassment and sexual assault, on the other hand,
it's a harder case.
Right, they are more specific on coercion.
That's interesting. I guess that's probably why they ultimately chose, because that's specifically what they accused Louie CK of, these women. It was misconduct.
And also I think since sexual misconduct is more of an umbrella term, like these journalists, by using that term, could avoid themselves some, controversy or debate of terminology.
Yeah. I think it's notable, and I think it's noteworthy as to what these men who have been accused of these things, the specific accusations were.
Right.
Because I think, like we just explained with Louie, with sexual misconduct, I think they realized they couldn't really quite call it assault, that it would be a stretch. And I think they knew clearly it couldn't be called rape, but they knew clearly something was wrong with it.
Yeah.
So they had to use some sort of umbrella term that encompassed that. But that should be appreciated. That the fact that they even had to think about that in the case of Louie seems to illustrate to me that his actions were less wrong than somebody with whom they don't have to think about it and they can say, okay, no, I'm accusing you of rape. I'm accusing you of literally assault.
Yeah.
So I think that speaks volumes and emphasizes the point of levels of wrongdoing.
Right. I agree with that. Yeah. I think. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, ultimately, I guess the way I'll make one final statement here about everything we've discussed, and then you can make a final statement if you want. And so I guess the final statement I'd make is that, again, I want to emphasize that we've just been kind of philosophizing about the different ways of thinking about this, and I do think that what Louie did was wrong, and I think he should have apologized, and he should be shamed to some degree. I think all those things are true. The only thing I'm arguing for here is levels of wrongdoing and an appreciation of the nuances of human behavior, and having a sense of compassion when someone's remorseful for what they've done. So, given all those things, I think that we should not rule out that as a society we should allow Louie to come back into the public domain in the future and to do more stand-up or whatever he wants to do down the road. Maybe not in the next year, and maybe not in the next 2 years, but down the road he's shown remorse. Let him take some time off. And these acts were not only a long time ago, but he's apologized now publicly. He'll have some time to think, and he'll surely never ever do anything of this like this again. And I just want to make the point that I would actually not make that argument about Bill Clinton, because and I want to emphasize that this, because you might argue that I'm being biased with Louie because I like him a lot. But remember, I liked Bill Clinton too, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. But I believe. And this is why, for me, the actions that these people actually carried out are so important.
Right.
Bill Clinton was literally accused of rape. One of the women who accused him said that he came into her hotel room and forcibly raped her and actually left bruises on her body. Another woman said that he locked her in a trailer somewhere and took his pants down and started rubbing her penis on her body and saying, "Touch it." Right, these actions are hostile and certainly could be considered assault and rape.
Right.
And as much as I liked Bill Clinton, I don't think he deserves redemption from that. I mean, he can be forgiven, but I don't even think he should be currently in the public sphere. He shouldn't have been speaking at he shouldn't have been speaking at Hillary Clinton's the DNC when she was running for president. But Louie, on the other hand, his actions are redeemable, I believe. And so that's the way my final word on this topic.
Right. Yeah, I agree that we should at least allow the possibility and encourage rehabilitation or some sense of that. But if I have to make a general point to end our conversation, I think it would be this. I think when we are encountered with an accusation or a story, it's important to not only look into the specifics of that story and to critically evaluate how specifics alter or determine our attribution of wrongdoing in the case, but also to step back from the specifics and to say to sort of distinguish between social significance of these stories, meaning that women are finally stepping out and to express their experiences freely, social significance, but also distinguish that from the more theoretical, ethical, legal significance. So I think you could be outraged by these stories, but at the same time, don't make judgment so fast that you are actually not being fair to both sides of the story. And I think it's also important to just to think about what really lies behind all these disputes. And I think in this case it's the significance of informed consent and whether we can have it in certain circumstances, what factors undermine it or invalidate it, and use this theoretical framework and then go back to the story to see how we can apply that theoretical framework to determine whether there is in fact informed consent in the particular story that we are interested in.
Good, perfect. I couldn't agree more, and that's a good way to end it. That's absolutely what we should do when these stories come out. All right, Lin, thanks for being a guest on the podcast.
Thank you so much.